Early March 1941, North Africa. The heat hit me the moment I stepped off the truck. It was like walking into an oven. My throat dried up instantly. The desert stretched out before me, an endless sea of sand and dust. A far cry from the snowy fields of the Eastern Front, where I had spent the past few years. The wind here wasn't biting cold, it was hot and suffocating. A constant reminder that this was not the same kind of war one had known. I had seen the brutal cold of Stalingrad, the dead silence of frozen forests, and the misery of war during the long winter. But this was different. The sun hammered down without mercy, and the very earth beneath my feet seemed to burn. But I had little time to adjust. The Afrika Korps was already engaged in its campaign, and the British were waiting for us. I didn't even have time to take in the surroundings properly before I was shuffled into position, the familiar feeling of tension returning. The men around me were already at work, unloading supplies, preparing vehicles and checking their weapons. They spoke little, but their eyes betrayed their thoughts. No one had to say anything. This was the desert, and it was either kill or be killed. I'm Oberleutnant Karl Becker, 33 years old, a soldier of the Afrika Korps, and I've just arrived in the North African theater, after surviving the blood and mud of Russia. The German army had been fighting on the Eastern Front for so long it felt like a lifetime, and now here I was, at the edge of another world, a new front, a new kind of hell. We were assigned to a small camp just outside of Benghazi, a coastal city in Libya. It wasn't much, just a few tents, trucks, and a scattering of tanks parked under the sweltering sun. But it felt like home after what I'd been through. There was a sense of brotherhood among the men, even if it wasn't the same camaraderie I'd known on the Eastern Front. Everyone here was a soldier first, and for now that's all that mattered. That first day I didn't meet Rommel himself, but I did hear his name being mentioned constantly. It was clear that he had already won the respect of the men under his command. But the desert wasn't kind to anyone, and I had my doubts. I'd heard stories about General Erwin Rommel, the leader of the Afrika Korps, even before I arrived. Men spoke of him with a kind of awe, how he led from the front, his bold tactics, and his uncanny ability to outsmart the enemy. I'd never seen him in action, but I was eager to witness it for myself. The idea of an offensive in the desert, moving quickly, striking hard, it was unlike anything I had been used to on the Eastern Front, where things were slower, drawn out. But Rommel was different. They said he was a genius. They said he could make miracles happen. The first time I saw the tanks, I was struck by their size. The German armored divisions had always been a force to be reckoned with, and the Afrika Korps was no different. They looked like beasts of steel, ready to charge into the fray. I was assigned to assist with reconnaissance, gathering information about the British positions, the layout of the land, anything that might give us an edge in the coming battles. My orders were simple: find the enemy, report back, and avoid unnecessary engagements. In the desert, stealth was key. We didn't have the luxury of the dense forests or urban terrain where we could hide. Here, every movement was visible, every vehicle a target. I went out with a small unit, riding in the back of a truck, the wind howling past us, whipping up the fine sand and dirt. As we moved, the landscape never seemed to change. It was endless. The sun was relentless, burning everything it touched. The heat here wasn't just physical, it was oppressive, weighing down on you, making you feel like you couldn't breathe. I tried to concentrate on the mission, but my thoughts kept drifting to the past, the cold winters, the suffering on the Eastern Front, the faces of my fallen comrades. As I climbed into the hatch of one of the Panzer RVs, I felt a rush of excitement. It was almost like I was back home in the snow, hearing the familiar hum of a tank's engine, feeling the vibrations beneath me as I took my position. But this wasn't snow. This was sand. And sand, as I was quickly learning, was far more unforgiving. We drove for hours before reaching the outskirts of an area where the British had been spotted. There we found signs of their presence: abandoned vehicles, smoke rising in the distance, and the occasional distant sound of artillery fire. The British were just as entrenched in this unforgiving land as we were. It didn't make sense to me. I had thought we were the ones in control. But the more I saw, the more I understood the desert was its own master, and it made no distinctions. The first skirmish happened unexpectedly. We were scouting a small ridge when we heard the telltale hum of enemy aircraft. Before I knew it, the sky was filled with the roar of engines, and bombs began to fall around us. We scrambled for cover, diving into the loose sand as the British planes strafed our positions. I could hear the explosion of bombs all around, the sound of metal tearing through the air. The men were shouting, diving for cover, but the air was thick with dust, and I couldn't see anything clearly. It felt like being caught in the jaws of some beast, helpless and exposed. By the time the planes passed, the air was still, but the damage was done. The ground was littered with craters, and a few of our trucks were destroyed. But it wasn't the destruction that stayed with me. It was the realization that this was the new kind of war one had entered into, the kind where one mistake, one miscalculation, could end your life in an instant. It wasn't about long marches or cold winters anymore. This was about the sheer unpredictability of the desert. The next few days were a blur of skirmishes, movements, and long hours of waiting in the heat. We learned quickly to keep moving, never staying in one place for too long. The British had their own air superiority, but we were learning how to counter it. Rommel had always believed in swift, aggressive tactics, and it was becoming clear that this was the way to survive in this unforgiving land. But the more we advanced, the more I understood how fragile that approach could be. The desert was relentless. It didn't care how bold our tactics were. It would grind you down just the same. I spent the first few weeks in a kind of haze, adjusting to this new reality. The sun, the dust, the constant tension, it was all so different. But there was also a strange sense of purpose. Rommel's name carried weight here. The men believed in him, and I began to see why. He was a leader who understood the desert and who demanded the best from his men. As I lay down in the sand that night, exhausted, my eyes caught the first stars beginning to appear in the sky. The air was still, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel a sense of peace. But deep down, I knew that peace wouldn't last. There was a battle ahead, and it was one we couldn't afford to lose. In the end, it was clear. The desert was as much a part of the battle as the enemy. And we were here to win, no matter the cost. The night passed slowly, the desert's chill creeping in after the oppressive heat of the day. I could hear the sounds of the men around me, whispering softly in the darkness, trying to rest despite the constant hum of distant artillery and the ever-present sense of tension. The stars above, like distant pinpricks of light, seemed indifferent to the struggles of the men beneath them. There was no comfort in the desert's vastness, only the eerie quiet that settled in after the noise of battle. March 1941, North Africa. The desert had swallowed many men whole, and I was just one more. But I would survive at least long enough to see where Rommel would lead us. I lay there, staring into the dark, replaying the events of the past few days. The heat, the dust, the relentless pursuit of the British. It all felt like a fever dream, an endless blur of sunrises and sunsets, with no sense of time. For a moment, I wished for the cold again, the biting, merciless chill of the Russian winter. At least there, I knew where I stood. But here in the desert, it was different. Everything was constantly shifting, the land as unforgiving as the men who fought on it. The silence was broken by the sound of a voice low and steady, a German accent cutting through the air. It was Hauptmann Muller, my commanding officer, calling for a briefing. We gathered quickly, still half dazed from the lack of sleep. I squinted in the darkness, waiting for the command to move out. Muller, tall and imposing, stood before us, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of the campfire. He was a veteran of the Western Front, and while I was still adjusting to this new theater of war, he had already carved a reputation here. The men respected him, and I could sense his unshakable confidence. It was exactly what we needed, for the storm we were about to face would test us all. "We will advance at first light," Muller continued. "The tanks will lead the charge, and the infantry will follow. Our objective is clear: breach the British defenses and take control of Tobruk. Speed and surprise are our allies. Move fast, hit hard. The British have entrenched themselves near Tobruk, gentlemen," Muller began, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "Our task is to take the port city. This is no longer a scouting mission. This is an assault." His words hung in the air, heavy and final. Tobruk was no small target. It was a vital British supply base, and its capture would give the Afrika Korps a crucial foothold in Libya. Rommel had been planning this for weeks, carefully positioning our forces for a decisive strike. But even the most carefully laid plans had their risks. We had no illusions about what lay ahead. The British would not give up this city easily. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the men. I could feel the tension building in the air. Every one of us knew that this would not be an ordinary battle. This would be a test of everything we had learned in the months since our arrival. The speed of our advance, the precision of our strikes, the ability to adapt to the shifting desert conditions, everything would be put to the test. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the camp was alive with activity. The hum of engines filled the air as the tanks rumbled to life, their tracks digging into the sandy earth. I climbed into my Panzer IV, feeling the familiar thrum of its engine beneath me. The warmth of the tank's interior was a welcome relief from the cold desert mornings, but I knew that warmth would be fleeting. "Remember," Muller added, his voice growing softer, "we fight for Rommel's vision, for the glory of the Reich. But more importantly, we fight for each other. Keep your wits about you and we'll make it through." With that, the briefing ended, and the men began to prepare. There was no room for hesitation. We knew our roles, and we knew the stakes. The night was spent checking weapons, refueling tanks, and ensuring the supply lines were ready. The men moved quickly, quietly, each with a sense of purpose that seemed to sharpen with every passing hour. The desert still felt endless, but in that moment, it felt as though the world had narrowed to a single point to Brook. The desert would soon be filled with the sound of war again. The rolling sand dunes would become a battlefield, and we would be the ones to carry the fight to the British.